This video is just a somewhat more in-depth version of the basic no-knead method video shown above. I explain some of the steps in more detail and put in some plugs for some of the baking tools I use. This time, before I mix together the dry ingredients, I'm going to weigh out the flour using this scale. Now, most of the time you can get by just fine without using a scale, but there can be a considerable difference in the amount of flour one person will get into a cup compared to another, depending on how tightly the flour is packed. That's why most bread recipe books list the ingredients in weight as well as volume. In this Peter Reinhardt recipe book, for example, you can see that in the left column he lists the ingredients in volume, and in the center column the equivalent in ounces. At the King Arthur Flour bread baking classes that are held around the country, Carolyn Hack, one of the instructors, teaches how to properly measure out a cup of flour. The way they explain it is when you first get your flour, you have to fluff it up because it's compacted during packaging and shipping. And then once you've done that, you just sprinkle it gradually into your measuring cup until you have a brimming cup. And then you can level it off with your bench knife. And that should give you 4 1/4 ounces of flour. And if you do it this way, you get consistent results when you're baking. And in fact, it comes out to 4 1/4 ounces. So it's a good system. Now compare that to what I typically do. Take your cup and smash it into your bowl of flour and kind of roughly level it off and put it into your bowl. And it comes out to 5 1/8 ounces. So that's almost 20% more flour. So it's a huge difference in how you measure your flour out. This is one big reason why I use a scale to measure the flour. It's so much easier than the sprinkle technique. You just put your bowl on the scale and zero it out and measure in the amount of flour that's called for in the recipe. No guesswork involved. When I'm trying a recipe for the first time, I want to know I'm getting as close as possible to the results intended by the creator of the recipe, and that's when I'll use a kitchen scale in particular. As far as the basic no-knead recipe goes, you might want to weigh out the ingredients at first, but the recipe is so simple, you'll quickly get a feel for the right moisture level without super precise measuring. That's what you see in the famous New York Times video. The baker Jim Leahy appears to just be throwing things together. So, getting back to things here, after a little experimenting with the no-knead method, my own personal preference is using a cup of whole wheat flour and 2 cups of white bread flour. That translates into 5 ounces of whole wheat flour. That's 5 ounces of whole wheat flour. And then I add an additional 10 1/2 ounces of white flour. Sometimes I like to put in a little rye flour also. You can certainly experiment with different types and ratios of flour. Okay, and then 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt and a 1/4 teaspoon of instant yeast. That's all you need, is just a 1/4 teaspoon. And it may not be easy to find true instant yeast in your average grocery store. This SAF instant yeast is really good stuff. If you can't find it locally, you can get it from me on this website. Rapid rise yeast and quick rise yeast might work for you, but they aren't designed to give you a second rise, which you need for the no-knead method. Then I just mix up the dry ingredients. And stir in 1 1/2 cups of purified or spring water. Now, don't use tap water, as it likely has chlorine in it, which is put there to kill harmful bacteria. And it doesn't know that your yeast, a living organism, is a good thing. Now, here's another plug for one of the products that I carry. I just love this dough whisk. It's next to my La Cloche, it's my favorite baking tool. It's great for mixing wet or heavy dough, and it cleans up real easily. So just mix in the water and stir for a few seconds until the water and the flour are mixed well together. You're going to end up with a very wet mixture, And all you have to do at this point is cover the bowl with plastic wrap, or what I like to do is just put it in a large plastic bag. Some people also put a shower cap over the bowl, whichever is easy for you, and just let sit for 18 hours at room temperature. Okay, it's the next morning, 18 hours later. I'm going to scrape the wet dough out of the bowl onto a floured surface with this very handy plastic dough scraper. And then going to flour the surface of the dough lightly, and my hands, and gently spread the dough out like this. Just spread it out enough so that you can fold it back on itself, as I'll demonstrate here in a second. Well, that's probably good enough. And then just fold it in thirds like this. And sometimes it's so wet that you have to use a spatula or a dough scraper to assist in this process. And then just fold it in half again, like that. And then just cover it loosely with plastic and let it rest for 15 minutes. Actually, it's a good idea to flour the top a little bit too, so the plastic doesn't stick. And let it rest for 15 minutes. Sometime during this 15-minute rest period, you want to prepare a proofing basket or a towel-lined bowl or colander to place the dough for the final rise. I use a coiled proofing basket lined with wheat bran. Whatever you use to hold your dough during the final rise, it needs to be well coated with something to keep the very wet dough from sticking to it. Besides wheat bran, cornmeal or rice flour should work okay too. Now I spray a light coating of vegetable oil in the basket. This is olive oil, and it holds the wheat bran in there nicely. Sticks to the edges just enough. And it's also easy to clean up afterwards. I use a little basting brush to wipe it clean. So that's now prepared and ready to hold the dough for the final rise. Now after the 15-minute rest period, you want to invert the dough and shape it quickly and gently into an approximate ball, and place it in the proofing basket and cover it with a towel this time. Don't forget to flour your hands because it's still going to be very wet and sticky dough. So just invert it, shape it into a ball. This is just a few second process, and place it in the proofing basket. And this time cover it with a towel for the final rise. I've baked quite a few loaves now using this no-knead technique, and I've consistently found that about an hour and a half is a good amount of time for the final rise or proofing period. But this has all been during the winter months here in Iowa, and the room temperatures tend to be a little bit on the cool side. So if you live in a warm climate, or if it's during the summer months, you may find that a shorter proofing period works better for you. Now, one of the main reasons that the no-knead method creates such great bread is that you're going to be baking the bread in a preheated clay baker, a covered Dutch oven, or a covered Pyrex or Corningware type of casserole dish that traps the steam from the cooking dough. I use a La Cloche clay baker, which is one of my favorite things in the world, and it takes about 35 minutes in my oven to preheat it to 500 degrees. So after I put the dough in the proofing basket, I set my timer for 55 minutes. After 55 minutes, I put the La Cloche in the oven, set it to 500 degrees, and set the timer to 35 minutes, so that'll bring the total proofing time to an hour and a half. Okay, now it's been an hour and a half, and I'm going to put the dough on the La Cloche. Sometimes it helps to sprinkle a little dough on the base of the La Cloche to keep the bread from sticking, although it usually doesn't stick anyway. And then I invert the dough gently onto the base of the cloche by putting my fingers over the dough and just turning the basket. And it drops right out. That's one of the great things about working with a proofing basket. And then put it back in the oven at 500 degrees for 30 minutes. Then after 30 minutes, take the lid off, reduce the temperature to 475, and bake for the remaining 15 minutes. These times and temperatures work well for me, but may have to be adjusted a little depending on the type of container you're using to bake in. For some Dutch ovens, for example, to avoid creating too hard a crust, you may need to experiment with reducing the heat and the cooking time some. Okay, the bread's done baking. So I'll just put it on this cooling rack and come back in a couple hours and slice it open and see what it looks like inside. Okay, the bread should be cool by now. Let's see what we have. Crust is certainly crispy enough, and it's got a nice open crumb structure, big holes. If you like really big holes, then just use less whole wheat flour. Also, the wetter the dough, the bigger the holes tend to be. So this is pretty good. This is about what you get when you use the no knead method. So that's the basic no knead recipe, but there's awesome endless variations of this basic recipe just by experimenting with different ingredients. And the relative ease of the no knead method compared to traditional baking techniques makes experimenting that much easier too. Okay, thanks for watching.